All right, so here we are, unlocking neurodiversity in teams. We are Shooksvensen, and we, as a company, our aim is to help organizations create great places to work by working on their culture and working on leadership. And these webinars, Rewiring Workplaces, this is one of the things that we offer for anyone who also works on culture. So learning and development people, HR, and coaches, people external to organizations, to provide topics that help many different aspects of culture development. Today, we are going to be talking about neurodivergence and neurodiversity in teams. And I have with me Nathan Whitbread. Nathan, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yeah, I think that's come across just fine.
Okay. So, Nathan, thank you for being here. Nathan is a coach that specializes in neurodivergence, and his company is called the Neurodivergent Coach. And so pleased to have you here today, Nathan. We'll be talking about, I'll show you in a moment, our set of topics that we aim to discuss in a conversational format. But I just want to say a little bit about Nathan. Nathan has been a consultant and a coach for some time. He's a trained coach, ILM level 7, executive and leadership coach. And Nathan, something I learned about you by digging into your LinkedIn profile is that you have a certificate in the from the neuro-inclusive practice. Now that's an organization I didn't know about before, so it was great to know about that. Maybe we can hear a little bit about that. And as a speaker and coach, Nathan specializes in helping make the neuro-inclusive workplace a reality. Love that expression. Nathan is a father of 4. I love these personal aspects also. Nathan is a father of 4, runner, skipper, who is diagnosed dyslexic at the age of 35, and has started coaching in 2015 to enable neurodivergent individuals and teams be more effective, happy, and engaged at work to reach their goals and be more effective. We're totally in alignment about our purposes in our businesses, and you have a specific focus on neurodivergence. So I love that we have such crossover there. And of course, Nathan is talking about how to amplify strengths and manage difficulties effectively, with the emphasis really on amplifying strengths, because there's so many strengths to amplify with people who have different kinds of brains. So here's some topics for today. What are neurodivergent traits and needs? So those traits that can be great strengths, how do we leverage those and leverage all the differences, and perhaps manage some needs that come along with some of those neurodivergent traits. And also specifically looking at the stressful impact of change, and then creating some tips for creating team agreements, or a way forward really for neuro-inclusion. Yeah, so I'm going to stop sharing, and we're going to get Nathan and I spotlighted. And those of you who are here as audience members, thank you for being here. It's great to see so many of you. Please do add in the chat box any additional comments you have or questions you have, and there will be time for questions. I'll try to integrate those as we go. So here we go. Nathan, I've just introduced you. Is there anything else you want to say?
Well, thank you so much. It's always interesting hearing someone else talk about you. It's always a bit strange, isn't it? But no, I think you've pretty much covered it. Yeah, so I've worked in this area for a while. I'm really passionate about seeing this idea of a neuro-inclusive workplace become a reality, and I think quite often that is around the way we behave as teams and the way we interact together, because that's such an important way as organisations of how we operate. So it's brilliant to get this invite to come and spend some time with Laurie and talk about this subject.
Great, thanks, Nathan. So let's start with neurodivergence. I've been looking at neurodivergence in the last month, going to different webinars myself, and this really is about sharing with our community all of the different things that are out there, sort of a collation of things. And one of the first things I needed to learn was the difference between the terms neurodiversity and neurodivergence. And I mean, some basics, maybe people would like to know about that. But we'd also like to know, tell us, your view of
Okay.
neurodivergence and
Okay,
neurodiversity.
so to start with the word neurodiversity, neurodiversity was a term that was coined by a woman called Judy Singer, and in association with another individual called Harvey Bloom, based in the US. Judy Singer is based in Australia, and that was looking specifically at autism. And the idea of neurodiversity was that autistic thinkers think differently. Since then, the term has broadened, really, I think, to describe the fact that we all think differently. So we are all neurodiverse. Now, within being neurodiverse, we then have what would sometimes be described as neurodivergent, and that often relates to some of the diagnosis you may have heard of, like autism or autistic spectrum disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia. There are quite a few of them, Tourette's. And when we talk about these, we're actually talking about traits. So, and what I mean by that is that these conditions have various aspects to them that appear at different levels in different people, and they would be described as neurodivergent traits. Now, the other component just to consider here as well is to say there is also this concept of acquired neurodivergence, and that can be linked sometimes to PTSD or trauma,
Yeah.
or in older age, it can be sometimes linked to things like I don't know, my brain's just gone dead here, but I'm thinking about like degenerative brain conditions can cause similar kind of traits to appear. So it's worth being aware of, there's quite a lot of different ways that you can end up in this kind of neurodivergent pot. But ultimately, it's about describing the fact that that people that are neurodivergent think differently, and more significant differently to just being neurodiverse in different ways.
Yeah. You know, I was just reflecting this morning actually on that quote that says, diverse teams make the best decisions. And there's a couple of caveats on that. It isn't just any kind of diversity. Actually, the research shows it's diversity in thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Well, wow, what a great opportunity. Let's actually go for neurodivergence because we'll get more diversity in thinking, which creates better decisions, as long as we're inclusive. And I know that you're working on the inclusivity part, you know, great to bring in all these different people, but if we're not inclusive, if the teams and the organization isn't working at being inclusive, it actually doesn't help. It can backfire.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful point, Laurie, and especially when you look at an organization that says, actually, maybe we really want to hire someone who's, or individuals who've got particular traits, and we make it look very good at the front door and say we've got this hiring program, it's maybe particularly focused on this particular set of individuals. But then we have to think about, well, what does that mean for those individuals when they come into the organization? Are they going to see role models in the organization, for example, at senior levels that look a bit like them, or that they can kind of relate to? And have we thought about their whole sort of cradle to grave journey in terms of their entry and exit, in terms of how they're going to be able to be okay, not to be okay at any point during their journey? And are we prepared to adapt and change in order to facilitate them to be their most effective at work?
Yeah, a lot for organizations to think about, huh?
Yeah, big stuff.
So I know you don't like to use labels, and so let's just talk a little more about some of the traits. Like, what are some of the great traits, the great, brilliant, genius kind of traits that neurodivergent people bring to an organization?
Well, if we just look broadly speaking, and this is super broad, not talking about specifics. So if we took, for example, the autistic spectrum, quite often some of the strengths that are seen are around focus, specifically on a specific subject that they're passionate about. And that can really help to kind of zero in and do some really effective work in different ways. But if you look at something like ADHD, for example, quite often you see really high energy and idea creation, which can be really powerful for organizations. These are connectors, quite often the life and soul of the party, so to speak. Or if you look at dyslexic traits, you get huge big picture thinkers. These are the people that walk into a room and see all the dots that need to be joined up that everyone else is missing, because they're not, they just don't see it because they may be stuck in the detail of what's going on. And quite often incredibly empathetic as well, in terms of associating with people and connecting ideas together, which is one of the big challenges, I think, sometimes in our organizations, how we do that effectively. We might have lots of really good work going on in different places, but bringing it together is quite often the glue that that kind of unlocks innovation. And there are many others as well. You know, these are just some of the ones that come out.
Feels like there's such powerful, huge pool of resources out there that we really could be tapping into.
Yeah, totally. And I think the key thing to it, Laurie, is just to make sure that people feel safe and they feel that they can contribute, because with lots of these sort of neurodivergent traits, there are strengths that ideally we want to kind of amplify and help people be their most competent and good at, matched with some difficulties that can sometimes get in the way. And the problem comes is, I mean, I like to think about the analogy of a really nice sports car, like a Ferrari. Would you buy a Ferrari to do your weekly shop? Probably not. You get your Ferrari to go on a track day. And actually, and it's the same with individuals sometimes. Some of us are really made and designed to do some things really, really well. But if we ask those individuals to do things that they're really not suited to, and then get, shall we say, upset about the results that happen, that can be really detrimental to that individual, because they zero in, and I know this is true for lots of individuals, we zero in on the things that we perceive that we're rubbish at or difficult, and we totally fail to appreciate the things that we're good at because we assume everyone else can do them.
Yeah. Well, this is something I just use, not even for neurodivergence, but in all kinds of culture development, is how do you leverage people's strengths and focus on strengths-based working? You know, the whole Marcus Buckingham approach to strengths-based working. And don't spend all that time trying to fix the low scored areas in each of us. You know, I mean, that's such a waste of time. People aren't going to enjoy that, for one thing. And, you know, you spend a lot of time and you might come out as mediocre. But if you really leverage the things that are above average already, you really get mastery. Yeah. I love that whole approach. And I love it even more when we're talking about neurodivergent traits.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing, and to be okay with the fact that people are going to be a bit spiky in terms of how they look, in terms of their profile. They're going to have some outstanding stuff and some things that are really quite challenging for them. So we can help limit that a little bit, the stuff that's challenging, but allow them to really amplify the things they're great at. And the worst thing I think we can do sometimes is ignore the things that people are great at because we're trying to help them fix stuff that maybe they're having a little bit of difficulty with.
Yeah, what a shame.
Yeah, totally.
So let's talk about managing some of the difficulties, and then let's, really get into creating this. Then we'll go to safety and how to make it safe for people to really expand on what they're great at. So there are some difficulties. I think that's just a pragmatic thing to say. We want to focus on the strengths, but there are some difficulties. What are some of those and how they can be managed?
So first thing to say is that although we're talking about generalisms here, ultimately they're people in this equation.
Yes.
And people are wonderfully made and unique. And we just have to accept that. And that's brilliant. But because of that, it means that this has to be built around conversations, because we need to work out with that individual what they need. If that, or if it's a group of individuals, how that group is going to work together effectively, what they actually need. What I've seen from my experience, quite often people have what we call strategies or coping strategies to manage life. And we all build them up anyway. For neurodivergent people, they can sometimes be even more important to managing life. But if we can find things that have worked in other settings, there is often a huge opportunity to, I guess, repurpose or reuse some of those learnings, structural learnings, in different settings. So if we're talking about the individual, for example, time management might be a thing that comes up.
Sure.
So you can have a conversation that says, well, where have you made time management work for you in other parts of your life? And it might be around something they're really mad passionate about, or maybe in a family context. And then you can work with them in a coaching context to say, well, actually, how can we reuse that? What are you learning from what you know? My experience has been, there's been huge penny drop moments where people go, oh, I get that.
Yeah.
I can see that now.
Know how to do that.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's probably quite similar to your experience, Laura. People just suddenly seeing this penny drop moment. And that's true for teams as well, as we look at how we work together, because ultimately this is about people. And how do we work together, and how are we going to make this thing work? we need to look at other aspects and where things have worked successfully in the past and how we can reuse that and how we can get rid of the things that aren't useful.
Yeah. Do you have a team example where maybe a team has gotten together and there might have been one or two individuals who have some special characteristics or something that they need managed? I understand there's some people who are really sensitive to environments and loud sounds and things like that, as well as
so a good example, and I know we were talking about this earlier, is just talking around. So I've worked with some people around this whole idea of agile working and the Scrum process particularly, which I think is a really good methodology, especially if we really get it in terms of what it means for us and our organizations. But there's some parts of that some individuals find really challenging. So the morning stand-up meeting. So if you're familiar with this process, there's quite often a morning stand-up meeting where everyone stands up and they give an update on what they've done, what's gone well, what hasn't gone well. So for some individuals, they find that really challenging because they may feel that they don't actually want to talk. So they kind of pre-rehearse what they're going to say and they're not actually sharing information that's useful to the team. Or B, it's overwhelming for them. So actually what I did with an organization that we were working with was actually look and say, well, how can we make this different and make this better? How would you feel comfortable to share your update with the Scrum Master so they know what's happening, so then they can bring you in and support you? And it was as simple as deciding actually they were going to have a conversation, I think it was on Slack, before the meeting happened, just to give the updates in terms of saying, well, this is where I'm at, this is what I'm worried about, this is what I've achieved, this is what I haven't achieved. And then the Scrum Master was then able to manage that really well and bring them into the conversation. But it just meant they'd move from non-kind of involvement to being involved. And quite often, once someone is involved, then they can then fulfill what it is that the team needs. But it's just that critical component of actually getting them involved in the conversation.
Right, because if they show up and aren't involved, that defeats the whole purpose.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that seems like such a simple and even obvious fix after the fact, But it's conversations, like you said earlier. People need, what's going to work? How do we get this to work for you?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. So much of this stuff is really super simple. But as with all great super simple things, it's super simple after the effects, after you've kind of done the work to work it out. But it's the working out, or sometimes I like to describe it holding the chaos, in terms of holding what's going on to work out what needs to change. Yeah. And that's the role, I guess, of professionals who are coming into support organizations to say, look, don't just throw everything away. Let's hold where we're at. Yeah. And let's work together to kind of suss out how we can move this forward effectively. Yeah.
And I imagine sometimes there can be specialists in the organization as well who can just make that standard practice for teams. And
definitely.
So that can be developed as an in-house capacity.
Yeah, there's definitely scope for that, and I've seen that work quite nicely as well.
Great. So those are great examples. So shall we talk about safety? You mentioned that a few minutes ago of, there needs to be safety to have these kind of conversations, to come up with the different simple approaches, or also the safety to contribute the wild ideas or the super specialty that people bring. So talk to us about safety.
Well, there's kind of basic level that we've got the kind of psychological safety stuff that people actually feel safe that they can be themselves at work, which I think is something that we probably all experience, especially in this post-pandemic, or even post, I don't know, but this moved on a little bit from the pandemic world. We're dealing with some really complicated stuff. And what I'd add, if it's okay, just to add at that point, with regards to neurodiversity and neurodivergent conditions, I think the pandemic has been a key moment in time for flushing out stuff, because people have had such a huge change in working practices. It has forced them to look at themselves differently, and these things have really come to the front. So just a sort of there's a page stop there.
I think it's an important point. I've heard that from a few different people. Is the reason this is such a hot topic right now is because of the pandemic.
Yeah, it's definitely, and it has been good for some people, but it's been really challenging for others. Yeah, and that's a lot of that's to do with change, actually, in terms of what that's happening. Now, I have to confess, Laura, I've completely lost my train of thought.
So we were talking about building safety for people, and and you said we were talking about post-pandemic, and
I'm with you. I'm with you back here.
Yeah.
So yeah, so basic psychological safety is important, that there's trust, and that people, there is there's integrity between the relationships that are going on. But then there's also thinking about how do we create safe spaces for people to have conversations, and that might be appropriate within the team setting, i.e. the team leader or team manager, and that, but also having spaces outside of that with peers and having places to go that people know they can go if they're not feeling, if they're feeling like they're not okay, and to know that would be dealt with appropriately. So one of the things, for example, if people are really experiencing breakdown within the work environment, having that space to go to where they know they can talk to someone impartially who can help them to decide what they need to do next can be very important, and that can stop sometimes catastrophic breakdown in terms of that person feeling they need to leave the organization. So that's just some things to think about.
Yeah, and so for organizations, you said impartial, so that might imply someone outside of an organization?
Yeah, yeah, I'd say, I mean, in some instances, so something that that I've been sort of involved in is something called triage coaching. I mean, it's just another name really for just having a coach who is prepared to come in and be impartial, i.e. they're paid for by the organization, but they're not going to tell the organization what's happened in the room. They're just there to help that person think through what their options are. And that can be particularly important if someone's working out, do they want therapy? Do they want coaching? What is it they need because of where they're at? Or maybe it's diagnosis. What do they need to move forward? And that can be a really helpful point for them to move forwards. Especially if they're experiencing some significant difficulties in their working place.
Yeah. This may sound like a real super fine detail, but I think it's important. How do organizations set that up? Because the people have to have the safety to go contact that person. Is it like, here's your on-call person for a safe space? Or do they go to HR and say, I need someone to talk to? Or how does it usually work?
So the way that I've been involved in it is where I'll have a relationship with the organization. They will then get in contact and say, we've got someone we would like you to talk to.
Okay.
We don't know what it's about, but we know that it's serious enough that we'd like them to have a conversation with you. And we're happy that we don't need to know the details of the conversation.
Yeah.
But you've
so
got...
the individual has gone to someone in the organization and said, please, can I...
Yeah, ultimately, it obviously needs to be flagged because someone has to pay for it. So in terms of the transactional piece, but it should be, the idea that it's there when people know that someone is in a space where it's not when they're just feeling a little bit awkward, it's where they're going, well, actually, I've got something serious I need to kind of deal with here.
Yeah.
But I've recognized that it would be helpful to have a conversation with someone who can help me kind of work out what I need to do next.
So the organization needs to set that up and create the safety for asking for it.
Yeah. So that may well sit outside of the sort of chain of command, much more as a HR function or even as a learning development function.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Sorry to get so distracted into all the...
No, you're right, but it's important though. I think that's really important though, because that so often it's the details that get missed. And if we don't get the details right, then people don't feel they have agency to kind of access the support that's there because they feel it will stigmatize them or...
Right. That's a lot of it, isn't it? Destigmatizing, normalizing. It's okay to not be okay, and what we're backing that with your resources.
Yes, and creating a space, because ultimately, as an organisation, what we really want is people to develop and be their absolute best at work.
Yeah.
And quite often, it's very small changes that can make a huge difference.
Yeah. Especially
if we can get involved early, before things become catastrophic.
Yeah, before they fester. And good. So let's shift to the conversation about change, if we can.
Yeah, sure.
I know that's a huge place where things do start to fester and become catastrophic, and there's upset that happens there. People handle change differently, and so what are you noticing about neurodivergent traits and how they interact with change?
Yeah, so one of the probably the most important things to understand about neurodivergent traits is, or people with neurodivergent diagnosis, is that they will use what's called coping strategies to deal with life.
Yeah.
And that might be really simple things. It might be stuff they write down. It might be stuff they have in their head. It might be stuff they practiced over and over again they're really comfortable with. And that just helps life work. So for me, for example, as a neurodivergent individual, I can talk about the fact that I have strategies to make my life work in terms of morning routine, in terms of even as I run this business, things that I do that I know if I do that in that way, I will not be stressed. It will just work for me. Now, when things change, those strategies can go out the window sometimes, completely or partially. But that is quite often a moment of anxiety and stress, because those things are so core to us being our most effective at work. So some of the work that I get involved with is helping people work out how to modify their strategies at points of change. Because what can happen is, if that isn't managed well, that can cause a really stressful situation where to an outside individual who's not that person, that may seem erratic, or, that person is, gone from performing to not performing because these strategies aren't there and they haven't got them to work through. And we always say as well when we're working with this, is that this can sometimes take a little bit longer than you would expect for when you're sort of factoring Joe Average's response or Jane Average's response to change. And it's being aware that neurodivergent individuals sometimes need a little bit more time to suss stuff out.
Yeah. Thinking about a conversation I had with someone recently about how not all neurodivergent people know that they're neurodivergent, but they have their coping strategies anyway. And it's those times of change that actually can highlight that, like we were talking about the pandemic. And it might even be the time when they recognize, oh, there are these coping strategies that I have, and they're being thrown out the window, and it's really disruptive to me individually and therefore to the team. I'm just thinking that's something we could be aware of. Is this maybe a time of discovery for people in that harsh change, that, oh, something isn't working for me?
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the adages, which I know is true for across lots of stuff, it's probably been a bit overdone during the pandemic, is this idea of being kind to yourself in this.
Yeah.
Because I think my observation would be that many neurodivergent individuals are very hard on themselves.
Yeah.
And especially when change happens, because it can be so disruptive. And this can also be good change as well, I should say. So that looks like, say, for example, someone that's been performing brilliantly in a role, has got a promotion, stepped up to the next level. The role has changed significantly. A classic example of that is a salesperson. So salesperson's been super good in the field. They've built brilliant customer relationships. Anything they touch just flies out the window. So they get promoted to sales manager. But then that's a very different role, because suddenly, although you will be doing some sales, much of your role is supporting your team and developing your team. And that can be a huge shock. And that can be really difficult sometimes, because you've also got the whole imposter thing potentially creeping in, going, well, I know that's natural for many of us, but actually that can be more significant for people and individuals with neurodivergent traits as well. So just being aware of that, and I guess making sure there's kind of a dialogue that says, this might not be difficult for you, but if it is, this is here to help you, guide you through this process.
So I think what I'm taking from that, where I expand that to, is HR, even L&D, leaders in organizations, external people, coaches and consultants. When going through a change process, there needs to be extra attention. We may disrupt people so much, more than we think. So we really, there's constant change, right? And it's just getting faster. And we need to just put in a little extra awareness, who's being really, really destabilized by this, and how can we change the change process, or put out extra support, or even have some informational kinds of things about handling change. Feels like things organizations could do more of.
Sometimes. And I think, and also there's another component just in terms of the detail of the change, because quite often when we first, the concept of change comes around, we may be starting with a really big picture of, we want to jig the organization in this way because we're going to change focus and do something slightly different. But for some individuals, that's going to scare the living daylights out of them until they get to the detail of what that actually means for them. So it's then working out, how do you manage that? How do you manage that really well? Because you may not have all the answers. but you might be able to have enough trust between you and that individual that they're okay, that you can have a conversation that says, we don't know the answers yet, but as we do, we want to hear about what your concerns are and how we can support you through that.
Yeah. And so we've got your model, your correct model, which we'll show in a little bit. That will help handle this, right?
Yeah, which hopefully be a step in the right direction.
Right. Good. We'll show that in a few minutes.
That's fine.
So I'm just thinking about all the different kinds of changes that we go through. And you've mentioned some to me before about like IT changes, like just IT system changes.
Yeah.
That's huge, isn't it?
So IT can be particularly interesting, especially when you so what we haven't touched on yet is that for some in the neurodivergent individuals, they not only have strategies, but they may also have assistive things that help them do life. Mm-hmm. So for me, again, that might be around dictation software, it might be around screen reading, it might be around how I organize myself. There's all these sorts of potential tools and they're called reasonable adjustments that will help me be my most effective. So IT change particularly can sometimes be really unhelpful, especially if you don't know it's coming. And it's that classic thing, isn't it? You've got a deadline looming, IT has changed, and suddenly your stuff doesn't work the way you'd like it to. And that can just be incredibly debilitating. So it's just thinking about how we do change and how we stage change. And making sure, and like any change, I mean, ideally it should always be a project of some description, but how do we make sure that we engage the stakeholders enough that they know what's going to happen and they can then manage that risk for themselves appropriately and there aren't surprises thrown at them?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just managed change. Let me just screen share here and go to your model. Feels like the conversation is calling for it.
Okay.
So here we go. Talk us through this correct model. And then there's a question in the chat. We'll come back to your question, Joe, after this.
That's absolutely fine. Yes. So it's just this. I mean, it's not. I mean, it's a model. It's kind of a way of thinking. I guess it just in terms of correct. So it's just change processes to be inclusive from the start, and that's thinking about why we do stuff. So particularly in the UK, it's just thinking about is our process inclusive? Have we thought about the impacts it's going to have on our team members? And actually, does it achieve what we really want it to achieve? Just that touching on Laurie's point about open and diverse teams, there's a huge amount of research that shows that people that come from different backgrounds have different experiences, different relationships, add new ideas and different ways to do stuff. And I really believe this is why neurodiversity and neurodivergent traits, for example, are an opportunity for innovation and excellence in organizations because they allow us to approach stuff differently because people are fundamentally standing at a different place in the room to look at a problem. And we can pay consultants to do it, or we can use the magic we've already got in our organizations. This idea of reviewing what's working, so let's look really critically at what's working and what's not, and making sure that we remove the stuff that's unnecessary, because unnecessary tasks are quite often created for good reasons at some point, but we need to keep evaluating why we're doing stuff. Is it still important? Does it still deliver on what we expect it to? Now, more specifically around the individuals, let's make sure we're engaging with the person, not the label. Now, why I say that is labels are useful if they give you access to resources or money or understanding or help, but they don't define who you are. They're just a lens looking at part of who you are. And that's so important because we are all unique and wonderfully made individuals. So it's vital that we don't end up sticking people in nice little boxes because they will feel boxed in. And as a result, I believe we won't necessarily get the best out of them and they won't be able to be their most effective. The C is just about checking in. So checking in, where are we at? Where are they at? Where are our teams at? Where are things working? And making sure we continue to review and be happy with the fact that things do need to change, but we need to react to what's working and what's not. Then the final bit is just take nothing for granted, because actually we're dealing with individuals here, and the greatest risk here is that we assume we know everything, because we don't. So if we don't ask, we don't inquire, and we're not genuinely listening to find out what needs to change, we're going to miss something.
Yeah, I love that. Take nothing for granted. Great. Well, I'll leave those slides up, and if anybody has any comments or anything on those, I think that's such a nice, comprehensive approach, Nathan. It's really helpful. And then Joe in the chat box had, well, first Joe had shared with us the term neurospiciness.
Not heard of that. Sounds great.
And then the question is, how do we best handle these kind of conversations in a team context? In other words, a design team alliance, which is something we use in the team coaching world, without labeling people. And I think this is a great conversation too. You don't have to say, okay, so you're ADHD and you're, autistic. What are we going to do? There's some general questions we can ask.
Absolutely, because you can also get into collecting badges if you're not careful, I think.
Got a little ADHD and a little autism.
Yeah, and that can sometimes be a bit tricky because that can put really barriers up as well, which is the last thing you really want to achieve. So the first, I'd say the way to start with a lot of this stuff is around awareness. So starting that conversation, and that might be, might just be a conversation about actually what does it mean to be neuro-inclusive? What does it mean? And I think at its basic level, it's about having conversations and making it okay to not be okay and to start, because I think we all know that we can't always make all the changes, but if we have a negotiated outcome that says, well, we can do this, but you need to give a bit on this so we can achieve this, then everyone is happier because they feel engaged and they feel they've got equity and they feel they can move forward. So I'd say that's the most important place to start. And then, like we said in this model here, looking at your processes, particularly how things are working. Are we getting the most out of the people in the team? Are they able to contribute and be their most effective? And if not, what are the barriers there? Because I would always argue that quite often the barriers are quite small, and small changes can have a huge difference on how people feel and how well they can turn up in team context.
Yeah, great. I'd like to add some things about that to the conversation. So you can just be open and say, what kind of differences are there here? And yet some people don't really know that they're in a different camp. And one of the things I've learned in my exploration in the last month or so is that a lot of the traits that neurodivergent people have, they're just maybe extreme version, it doesn't even have to be extreme, but strong versions of the traits we already know. Like somebody might be a strong introvert, or strong on, big picture and those kind of things. So Joe, to answer your question, and create team alliances, we don't have to invent new ways of asking the questions. We ask the same question. So, there are some introverts and some extroverts here. How are we going to manage that? And keep in mind that there may be some people who are further out than we're used to, and allow space and time for them to speak about that. You could also do some, individual profiling. I'm not a huge fan of profiling, but I'm realizing that this might be a great place to bring that in, to find out where are the spikes in people's profiles, because those are the differences, and then say, wow, look at these great opportunities we have for leveraging these kind of strengths. How do we bring those in? So it isn't about labeling, it's just about having the conversations and being more open to wider range of traits than we're, neurotypical people will inhabit.
I think there's also something here. Sorry, Laura, I was just going to add something that also is really helpful is how we contract. And what I mean by that is, so if we're talking about teams, how are we going to contract as a team in terms of how we're going to communicate? And making sure we're just really clear about that process in terms of and how we do that process, so we understand the preferences within the team, because ultimately every team is going to be unique because of the individuals involved. So we need to make sure that we understand the preferences to work out the best way that team can work together to meet the needs of the individuals within it.
Yeah, so in this contracting, the designed alliance is a type of contracting. Okay. So so how are we going to communicate? What are the best ways? What are people's preferences? There might be something also about the environment. How are we using our digital tools? When are we coming to the office? Even that can be part of a team contract. Who's comfortable coming into the office and who's not, now that we have these other options. How do we get the best out of ourselves by, coming in not, and when we're in the office, what's going to be the best environment? Who's really sensitive to noise and sounds and maybe needs to wear headsets? And I mean, there's lots of different places to go.
And also just building on that as well. So some of the people I've worked with recently, it's also being really clear about why we're coming to the office. And for example, with meetings, which are obviously a key component of lots of team activities, what am I expecting these individuals to bring? Do they know why they're there, what the expectation is? That we don't want you just hanging around all day. We need you here for this particular meeting because this is the time we're going to connect. So make sure you're here, present, then we're going to do this, and then you can go and do the work that we'd like you to do as part of your role outside of that. And just being clear about where that stuff is, because for some neurodivergent individuals, if stuff, I love Brené Brown on this, to be clear is to be kind, to be unclear is to be unkind. And if we're being unclear, there's often an awful lot of assumption going on, and that can be very, very destructive for some thinking styles.
Yes. And a lot of times we don't know we're in the midst of assumptions. So we need to be really aware and just start, I know that I have gained a lot of awareness in the last month just by researching this and paying attention. Like, oh, there's all these different traits and they're not bad, and they're there. And there's also this thing called masking where a lot of people will hide it. So we might not even notice them when they are there. But if we leave space, maybe people will have the chance to be really open and honest. Well, actually, I hate coming to the office, or, but we've got to create safety. So it comes back to psychological safety as well.
And masking, just to pick up on masking a little bit for you, Laura. So for those of you who aren't aware, masking is a big thing. And this is where people are effectively being something they're not because they feel need to hide who they are. So that can be exhausting, and that can have massive impacts for that individual, potentially outside of the work context, because guess where they unload? It's probably with the people they care most about.
Yeah.
And if they're having to do that and not getting the rest and relaxation they need in order to be their whole self, then eventually that gets to a point where that becomes quite destructive.
Right. So their work environment or workplace might be stressing them out so much that it really damages their home life.
Yeah, and that can then roll back in. I mean, as we know, because people are holistic, that can roll back in. So just being aware of that, that comes, and I think that comes back to the expectation piece. It comes back to the clarity piece in terms of actually we hired you to join this team because you do this well. We're recognizing that. Just because this team behaves like this in some ways, that doesn't mean you need to become like that. But this is kind of what is expected and what isn't expected.
Right. And when people start performing or stop performing to their normal standards, or to the expectations, there can be some curiosity about what is going on. There might be stresses outside of work, and those stresses outside of work might be what you were just talking about, of actually it was stresses inside of work that was, coming into the outside. So and that's one of the things we talk about a lot is, brain care and taking care of oneself, and having all those coping strategies and all of that are important for being one's best at work. And at work, we can support all that, support well-being and all of that, and the safe spaces to talk and all of that, because it supports our whole, holistic well-being, which supports the way we do our work. It all goes hand in hand, and it supports our life outside of work as well, which comes back to, we're one human being with one brain, one body that we take with us everywhere we go. And I think we can all be really more attuned to how is everyone taking care of this instrument that we have.
I like that.
And Eric is asking the question, how do neurodivergent populations relate to other marginalized groups? Wow, and how does this conversation relate to the DEI conversation? So intersectionality we're talking about. Nathan, please talk to us about that. That's a massive topic.
So, as everyone digging in for the next 4 hours? No, I'm joking.
I know.
So, I mean, this idea of intersectionality, in terms of, obviously, as I said, that, neurodivergent conditions are a lens on part of who we are. And we can be other things. We've got gender, race, socioeconomic background, which actually I would argue is a bit of probably one of the biggest problems, particularly in the UK, in terms of this kind of difference in terms of where we've come from and who our peer group are.
The socioeconomic differences.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's a huge, huge thing. So you've got all this stuff laced on top, and there's lots of evidence that suggests as well that people from certain socioeconomic backgrounds that are also in, have some of these neurodivergencies are disproportionate in the care system and in the prison population. So that's not to draw any conclusions, but just to say, well, that's what the data tells us. So this suggests that actually you're right. If you've got multiple things going on, that means because the way our society is structured, and I would argue we are making good steps in the EDI space, but we're still fundamentally, we like people that look like us, sound like us, and
think
agree
like
with us. Because they're nice, aren't they?
They're nice. I can relate to them.
But by the same token, we need more people that don't look like us, don't sound like us, and certainly don't agree with us, because that's how we innovate. So there is definitely, from my own anecdotal experience, I think when you fit into multiple, sort of these multiple sort of protected groups which come under the Equality Act, then that can make life more difficult sometimes, depending on the context you're working in, and especially within team concepts, if that team isn't able to come around that individual and make them part of the team, and they feel that they're not part of the team, that can be a huge issue, because that means that ultimately they can't be their best self at work. And a couple of things may happen. They may just choose to leave, or they may be unhappy and unproductive, or they might be quite disruptive because actually they're in that sort of fight. I'm feeling like a minority, and I'm not able to be, not able to really participate in this. So hopefully that I know that's a 50,000 foot view of a really, really complicated subject, but I think recognition, though, that people are more than their labels, but these different things can have a massive impact.
Yeah, we got this symbol from Eric. Looks like you're happy with that answer, Eric. Yeah, thanks for asking the question. Thanks for being here as well.
Yeah.
So I just want to shift the conversation for a few minutes to shooksvensen and the programs that we offer and how they relate to this conversation today. And then we'll come back to final words and from Nathan. And if there's other questions that anyone has, feel free to put them in the chat box. I think we handled the questions that are there so far. So at shooksvensen, we are passionate about helping organizations become great places to work, where they're inclusive, where they're productive, where there's psychological safety, and so on. And all of our programs start with this program called Rewired to Relate. And this is where we teach people about the basics of our brain and our natural human tendencies and how those drive us. So a minute ago, Nathan you were talking about belonging. You didn't use that word, but belonging is huge. If people don't feel like they belong, they will end up in a threat mode, brain threat mode, which means they will withdraw, they'll fight. It's a fight, flight, freeze space. So one of the first places we go in Rewire to Relate is help everyone understand 6 different elements, belonging being the first one, that are human needs. So there's belonging, there's fairness. If we are not feeling like we belong, we're not being treated fairly, we don't have certainty, those are things that have us be uncomfortable, stressed, and pull away from the organization and pull away from being our great selves. So in Rewire to Relate, we're teaching people about that, where it comes from in the brain, and what to do about it within ourselves. So self-understanding, what are our preferences, and as well as understanding others and how others might be reacting. Sometimes other people will react in ways that seem really irrational. And that's because we have a very strong irrational emotional brain that's bigger than our rational brain, and it's driving a lot of our behavior. And those people we think might be irrational, they're just reacting to some of these basic human needs, like the need for belonging or autonomy or certainty and so on. So understanding that and learning how to work with it in oneself and also in others can be really helpful. Also, there's a whole thread here about brain care. I was mentioning it a little bit a few minutes ago. We need to take care of our brains so that we can tap into our best thinking and our best selves and manage all of the stressors. It's a sort of an equation of here's a bunch of stress and how do I manage that so that I can do my best work. But if we don't have the capacity to manage it, it just goes spiraling out of control. So there's sort of an equation of take care of yourself, sleep well, for example, eat well, exercise, create an environment that's conducive for you and your brain, and create patterns for yourself that help you manage your brain and notice when you're starting to lose some of your best brain power. Yeah. And talk to somebody about it, like coming back to the part that Nathan was saying about, having a safe space. When you notice, I notice I'm maxed out. How do I do something about it? Well, here in Rewired to Relate, we're talking about how people do get maxed out and the ways to take care of their brains. So this program, just some of the logistics of it, it's a 6-week virtual program, all virtual. So some of it's online, so the content is online, but there's a whole very strong social learning aspect to it. So these bullet points just pretty much summarize what I just said a couple of minutes ago, or a minute ago. And here's some comments that people have made. We've had some amazing results from this program. It's a relatively easy program to invest in, both financially and time-wise, because it's about a half an hour a week for those 6 weeks, plus a conversation with others. So you access online program for about a half hour, do some interactive work, learn some concepts, and then you go talk about it with colleagues or friends or other people in a learning group. And the results have been phenomenal. People really recognizing different needs that they had that they didn't recognize before, or learning to manage their day in a way that helps them be their best self, or manage others, or understand others. A lot of understanding family members as well. So it's been a really great to get the feedback from people. So I'm going to stop sharing. Frodo's put in the chat box a place where you can get more information about Rewired to Relate, and there's a sign up, or a place you can come to sign up for a webinar that actually happens tomorrow. That was somewhat coincidental. That was the one I tried to invite you to, Nathan, earlier. So that's, you can find out more about Rewired to Relate there, and I think he'll put in another chat, or another link in the chat, Frodo, about just the page on the website about more about Rewired to Relate, if you've got that handy. There we go. Oh, and our blog. That's the other thing I wanted to have people know. There's all kinds of articles on our blog, a lot about what I've learned about neurodiversity and neurodivergence this month as I've been investigating things. So please do read that. And there will be one tomorrow that summarizes what we did today. So tomorrow's webinar has very little to do with today's. It's about Rewired to Relate. Like, what is the Rewired to Relate program? How does it work? And you can get any questions you have answered and talk through the program and how it works. Thanks for the comments in the chat box. Nathan, is there anything else you would like to say?
I'll just say thank you so much for coming to join us. It's a really important topic, this, and I just hope it starts some conversations and thinking from your side and your organisations. And the last thing I'd say is that, that one size doesn't fit all here. It's about innovating and changing. Don't be afraid to keep asking the questions. That's great. Keep asking the questions, keep being curious, notice your own boxes and biases and try to get beyond them. Yeah. And so your business is called the Neurodivergent with a T, coach. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And so if people want to contact you, they can look you up either on LinkedIn. Absolutely, yeah. I'm on LinkedIn, or you can contact me through the website. And if you just want to have a conversation, that's absolutely fine. I recognise, people are at very different spaces in this journey, but if there's anything I can do to support you, I'm more than happy to have a conversation. Super, thanks. And if there's any audience members here who would like to have a word, say something, add a comment or a question, mics can be open. I think you're allowed to unmute yourself. Thanks, Frodo. We put in the link to Nathan's website. Looks like some people have to go, so maybe we'll close for today. We'll see you next time. I have yet to figure out what our topic is for next month, but we do have a webinar planned for late in October. Thanks, everyone, for being here. This is also recorded if you want to revisit it. And meanwhile, we'll say goodbye for now. Bye. Take care.